Kia ora koutou, and thanks very much for tuning into this. The material I'm talking about is work in progress, part of a bigger project about difficult creatures in the settler south. The animals in these photos live in captivity in Australia and New Zealand. So we have a Palmer wallaby on the left and an Enderby Island rabbit on the right. And you might look and think, oh, these creatures, they look really cute. But if you're a New Zealander, you are programmed to want these animals dead. If you're an Australian, you might feel a bit of ambivalence or maybe loathing towards the rabbit, but quite protective of the wallaby or something like that. And my starting point here is that settler colonial places like Australia and New Zealand are extreme creators of feral ecologies, but the term feral is going to turn out to be perplexing in these kinds of contexts. This term comes from the Latin ferus, meaning wild, and fera, meaning wild animal, and it refers to something in a wild state, especially after escape from captivity or domestication. So something that used to be safely contained is no longer under control. There's a sense of degeneracy, menace and threat, kind of an eco-horror that's associated with rogue elements. And the reason that this term feral is perplexing in a settler place is that the animals that are now described as feral or biologically invasive were deliberately created as such through state-sponsored activities and legislation and through the work of acclimatisation societies. So my theme in this talk is going to be perplexity, which comes to us, this term, via Middle English and Middle French from the Latin perplexus. Perplexity might describe a state of confusion, a difficult or complicated situation or thing. It might describe an inability to deal with or understand something. So it suggests uncertainty, puzzlement, incomprehension, a situation where you're involved or implicated, but there's a pause or stutter because you don't know how to proceed. This word perplexity appeals to me as an alternative to entanglement, which has become a touchstone term in the fields of animal studies and environmental studies. And for me, I think perplexity drives a bit harder towards a problem. It asks you to see sides or fracture lines and a gulf or gap that interrupts and thwarts action. And a term like this one seems helpful to me in describing the ecological condition of settler colonial places like Australia and New Zealand. Early European visitors viewed Australia as a world upside down or a world back to front. Swans were black and not white. Mammals hopped around rather than walking. Some laid eggs rather than giving birth to live young. Others gave birth to immature fetuses that finished gestating in external pouches. When Europeans first began arriving in New Zealand, they were equally perplexed by the animals there. No terrestrial mammals except for a couple of ground-dwelling bats, large numbers of flightless birds that seemed to occupy the ecological niche of terrestrial mammals, insects like the giant weta that acted like rodents, penguins that inhabited forests, and so on. So endemic animals in these places were objects of perplexity. European newcomers saw these animals as being strange, abnormal, queer, and thus menacing or threatening to the natural order of things. In the European mind then, we want to think that settler world environments were already constructed as being feral, characterised as feral. They were full of rogue elements, things that seemed to be in a degenerate or savage kind of state. And campaigns of acclimatisation were actively pursued in order to correct or straighten up these places, bringing them under proper control as a matter of what I want to term ecological orthography. The idea was to domesticate the place, turning it into home by liberating formerly domesticated animals who would occupy or settle the place on behalf of settler peoples themselves. So northern world creatures were imported by the shipload, domestic animals, livestock, service animals, wild game, woodland favourites like hedgehogs, these kinds of things. And animals were transferred, as we're going to see in this talk, animals were transferred across the Tasman too. And it's clear that if European newcomers experienced initial perplexity, their response to this has generated further and deeper pipeline perplexities in these places. animals whose acclimatisation was sponsored and desired by settlers have gone on to be relabelled pests or noxious animals, in some cases demonised as public enemies and serial killers. And newly perplexed categories of animal have begun to emerge. So we have things like welcome invaders, familiar exotics, alien friends, nuisance companions, and exiled locals, to name just a few. So I'm interested today in the stories of this wallaby and this rabbit, and what these creatures tell us about the perplexed and perplexing category of the endangered feral. Cool. So this Palmer wallaby was brought to New Zealand by Sir George Grey, the colonial governor who purchased Kawau Island in the Hauraki Gulf as his private stately residence in the 1860s. Grey established a menagerie on the island and began stocking it with imported animals. And the Palmer wallaby, brought by Grey from Australia, shared its new home with zebras, antelopes, peacocks, and so on. Kind of diasporic menagerie that was the first of its kind established in New Zealand, and it was founded as an acclimatisation experiment to see what would thrive in the New Zealand environment. The animals that Grey brought in were intended for sport as much as for the pleasure of admiring. So Grey hosted shooting parties where people could come and hunt these wallabies as game trophies. There's a couple of images of this here. Grey's residence is now administered by the Department of Conservation as a historic reserve. Many of the animals that were brought to the island by Grey have not gone on to establish free-living populations, but this Palmer wallaby did. Over time, these wallabies have come to be considered a feral threat. They alter the forest composition and its ability to regenerate because they browse on seedlings. They graze vegetation, causing erosion on this island, and they compete for food with flightless birds that have been reintroduced to the island, native birds reintroduced there in the last 50 years or so. But over in Australia, concern began mounting in the 1960s that the Palmer wallaby had become extinct due to loss of habitat, predation by feral foxes and cats over there. But then this remnant population on Kawau Island was located. 736 animals were either repatriated to Australia or airlifted to zoos around the globe to participate in special breeding programs before, in fact, an isolated free-living population was rediscovered in New South Wales. So this creature here in the photograph is a creature that lives in the National Zoo in Canberra. That's where I took the photo. And Palmer wallabies in that zoo feature as part of a threatened species trail. This creature's conservation status is given as being vulnerable in Australia, but in New Zealand this same animal remains classified as a declared animal pest and noxious animal, and it's being targeted for control and eradication. So that's one of our endangered ferals. The other is the Enderby Island rabbit, whose story also dates from the 1860s. And just a note about the rabbit that we're seeing here, Enderby Island rabbits are usually silvery grey, but there's a recessive gene that sometimes produces the kind of creamy coloration that we see in this animal here. So the Acclimatisation Society of Victoria in Melbourne decided in October 1865 to release 12 British or French silver grey rabbits on Enderby Island, one of the subantarctic islands off the southern coast of New Zealand. And the idea was to provision the island for castaway whaling crews. These rabbits quickly settled to life on Enderby Island, breeding, we might suppose, like rabbits, and enjoying a largely predator-free environment. So they learnt to burrow into the sandy hillsides, they nibbled on grasses, they learnt to survive on seaweed when the going got tough. In 1934, the New Zealand government stopped issuing pastoral leases and gazetted the island as a reserve for native flora and fauna. And in the early 1990s, the Department of Conservation decided to eradicate feral pests, beginning with these rabbits. In 1992, before poison-laced pellets were dropped, the Rare Breeds Conservation Society of New Zealand secured a permit to rescue 49 rabbits from the island. These were live captured, ferried by dive teams on inflatable Zodiacs and taken to a waiting naval vessel, which then took them to a quarantine station in Wellington Harbour. And meanwhile, all rabbits remaining on the island were culled. And this clearing of subantarctic islands, clearing them of feral pests, has become a touchstone conservation moment, described by the New Zealand government as a glimpse of the future of predator-free New Zealand. And it's had economic implications too. So Enderby Island has been styled a kind of a subantarctic showcase destination for luxury cruise boats and their paying passengers. In the aftermath of the cull, the Enderby Island rabbit was listed as a distinct breed because of its 127-year or roughly 250 generation history of genetic isolation. It was declared the rarest rabbit in the world and put under the control of the Rare Breeds Society, and a special captive breeding program commenced to ensure its survival. So among its many and varied claims to ecological fame or infamy, the New Zealand government can include creator of the world's rarest rabbit. And in light of these two stories, I want to consider what Endangered Ferals tell us about perplexity. And I'd say, first of all, they reveal something about the place-bound nature of the meaning and value of an animal. Biosemiotically, biopolitically, these creatures signal vastly different things in different locations. An Enderby Island rabbit on mainland New Zealand does not mean the same thing as an Enderby Island rabbit on Enderby Island. So the rupture lines here turn out to be to do with the place rather than the animal. They tell us about a fractured life world, and they tell us that globalising conservation impulses to save endangered creatures aren't necessarily global in practice in the way that they play out. A second thing here is that endangered ferals reveal slippages in languaging practices over time, and these languaging practices encode distinct and contradictory moral judgments. So according to the acclimatisation agenda, the rhetorics there were all about selecting useful animals, cultivating free-living populations, and so on. When you rename a free-living population a feral population, you reconstruct it as being runaway, uncontrollable, degenerate, menacing, all of these things. Again, what's changed here is not the animals, it's the way that they are viewed and acted towards. And in fact, the Rabbit Council of New Zealand refers to the Enderby Island rabbit as a fancy breed by show class, which for me is quite hard to reconcile with the labels feral and free living as well. It's a very complicated picture of this rabbit that emerges here. And actually we might think not much has changed if animal species are still being targeted by the settler state as being unwanted and undesirable. So there are kind of historical continuities at work that conservation agendas don't necessarily care to acknowledge. A third thing that I would say here is that endangered ferals show how resilience is reframed as a negative value in respect of feral animals. In this era of mass extinction, where the survival of many species is in doubt, we might imagine that resilience would be seen as a virtue and a cause for celebration. But in a place of environmental perplexity, a resilient creature's resilience will turn out to be precisely what it is targeted for. So the Palmer wallaby and the Enderby Island rabbit have both experienced this as they've been willed towards critical endangerment or possible extinction. A fourth thing we learn from these stories is that conservation activities are founded on acclimatisation activities. We need to start seeing continuities here. Grey's Menagerie wasn't established as a conservation program. There was no idea at that time that captive populations could be held as insurance in case of calamity in a creature's home range. Enderby Island was not intended to protect those rabbits either, or to turn them into their own special breed. But the populations and the places associated with these creatures' feral lives have been the source of their rescue from threatened extinction. And for these two creatures, it isn't clear what kinds of futures they may have beyond the circumstances of captivity that they now find themselves in. The Palmer wallaby seems numbered in the wild, both in Australia and New Zealand. The Enderby Island rabbit is now living in a permanent state of enforced domestication. And a fifth and kind of final thing that I might say here is that endangered ferals ask us to pause. They sort of embody this idea of the pause of perplexity. They ask us to consider the bioethical dimensions of their stories. We might wonder, well, what's the right way to deal with an invasive arc which might serve as an insurance population for species or for genes that are at risk of extinction in a creature's home range? We might wonder, as creators of endangered feral species, what responsibility settler governments and settler populations might owe such creatures. We might wonder how moves to eradicate feral animals or to throw their populations out of equilibrium might run athwart Indigenous understandings of species life and life in place. What's the right course of action, we might wonder, and what might this have to do with tikanga or protocols for caring for country? And to what extent are so-called feral animals subject to identificatory practices and transferential disavowal, we might wonder as well. To expand on this just a fraction, I'm left wondering what a so-called feral animal might share with a beachcomber or Pākehā Māori, to use terms from New Zealand history that refer to settlers in the early phases of settlement who crossed over to immerse themselves in the new world of life that they found. I might wonder, well, what does a feral creature share with a bushranger or outback outlaw, to use terms that have a strongly positive value in the Australian context. And in thinking about George Grey's governorship, which used military force to subdue Māori rebellion, we might wonder, what do rebels and ferals have in common, and how might a creature end up on both sides of a ledger, identified both with settler populations and with Indigenous peoples in settler places. In the spirit of perplexity, I'm going to leave those questions there, just sort of leave them hanging. But I wanted to finish up with some images from the Enderby Island rabbit display at Willowbank Wildlife Reserve in Christchurch, where I took these photographs. Visitors enter this enclosure through a replica hut. There's a mural in the rabbit's enclosure that recreates a diorama of something that was an eco-horror from the point of view of settler society. Feral rabbits overrunning an island which needed to be cleansed for conservation purposes. So this scene reminds us, I think, that rabbits crossed the beach, both literally and metaphorically, and it reminds us that the enclosure itself is the new natural environment of this breed of rabbit, which has been thrust into permanent exile and has no remaining home outside of captivity. I'm sort of left wondering what the rabbits themselves might make of this vista, whether it might make them miss the kind of salt spray of home, something like that. The table in the hut that visitors pass through seems to be set for a forthcoming meal of rabbit stew, we might imagine. So the scene is asking us to picture trapping, skinning, preparing and eating a free-living or feral creature, which firstly remains the rarest rabbit in the world, secondly is only found in captivity, and third is associated with mass eradication via a government-sponsored poisoning campaign, which makes this whole prospect not very appetising, I think. At the same time, there's a pamphlet distributed by the Rare Breeds Society in the context of this display, which tells visitors that these rabbits are small and very suitable as pets. If you are thinking of getting a pet rabbit, why not an Enderby Island rabbit, and with it a piece of New Zealand's unique history, this pamphlet asks. And there's a cooking pot with a slit cut through the lid for visitors to post donations into to help save this rabbit. And the image work here, for me, there's something kind of deeply perplexing about it, this complicated creature whose display is just going to turn out to be complicated. And this seems to me peculiarly apt for what an endangered feral calls forth. Thank you.